Okay, so step one of this tutorial here, we're going to draw the center line along Colfax. And actually, because of how irregular the distance and width and kind of distribution of Colfax can be, that really means that we're going to start by drawing the edges. And then we'll work from the edges into the middle and then from the middle out to the periphery. So the first thing I'm going to do is make the default layer current. And we're going to work off of that default layer. And I'm going to create some straight line segments that basically go block to block at the crosswalks or the corners, and trace the edges of Colfax here along Jennifer's stretch. You can see that I have the oh well, you can't see. Now you can see I have the ortho snap turned on at the bottom here. You can toggle that by pressing this button. Ortho snap locks the line work into the 90-degree axis. You can temporarily disable that by holding Shift. And it works vice versa, where if you have ortho off, you can hold Shift to kind of toggle ortho on. So by doing this, we can kind of follow things along and snap when it breaks pretty clearly into the 90-degree axis versus not. And I'm coming along, and this is kind of going to be a choppy polyline, but that's okay, given that it's sort of a curving part of Colfax. Yes, Mariel?
So my Colfax kind of butts up in the 70s, so what I'm tracing, what do I do with that intersection?
Okay, so she's asking her section butts up into 70. Does it go under 70 or over it? It should go under it. So I would use where it disappears under the overpass as the kind of line work, and then work backwards from that. Similarly here on Jennifer's, we have a kind of a major road intersection. I'm kind of going to just try to find the logical pathway that that intersection meets. Okay, and it's okay to overlap the edge of your frame so that there's a little bit of a line segment coming off over the tab. But I am going to trim that using the picture frame as a kind of cutting object. So I've done one side, and I'm going to come now and do the other. You don't have to, if you have, say, open space that's hugging close to the road, you don't need to overlap that open space. Sometimes there's a fuzzy boundary between the road and the edge of the road, and that's okay. Just do your best to kind of find it. And you can see I'm not being super intense about getting it right on the line. I'm just doing my best to get it as close as possible. Okay, is everyone pretty much there? So we've added just another set of graphic information now that charts the edges of Colfax. In order to generate a center line that really uses these boundary edges as closely as possible, we're going to use a tool called the tween curve command. One of my favorite commands because it reminds me of like a vampire novel or something that's going to be themed by it. tweens are not quite teenage people. But it's the tween curve command. No one really got that. I thought it was funny. Yeah. Yeah, when there's a turn lane, like over here, just try to find the edges of the road as best as you can. Yeah. Okay, so tween curve, basically, it's a really useful tool for generating contours. And in this case, it's going to create a line that geometrically finds the exact center between the two lines that make up its perimeter. You want to just make sure that the refit points are both at the same end of the curves that we generated. So you might have to click one of the ends of the two curves to make sure that they match up. This sets the number of curves to be 1, but just for the sake of experiment, you can type in any number of curves and see how that starts to kind of populate the exact the averages between those two curves in increasing amounts. So let's say previewing 10, you get an idea for how that contour is being generated. We just need 1 because it'll be the center line. So everyone, does that make sense to everyone so far? Okay. The tween curve. I'm going to pause for a second. Okay, so I've since offset the lines at the center of the road out 1,500 feet in either direction. You can see that in some cases probably you got a kind of a glitchy line. All you have to do is sort of just make sure that everything is joined. So you'll see here I have 2 open curves. Each are offset from that center line. There's something kind of funny about the curve though, because the center line is so geometrically specific. The outline or the edge curves are also very specific, but not necessarily for any reason other than how carefully you drew the center line or the edge curves on Colfax. So what we're going to do is use the rebuild command. This is a great command for simplifying or adding complexity to line work that you might have in a file. So basically, you can experiment with these parameters, but as I increase or decrease the point count, it's going to kind of hold that line closer to the original. But the lower that number is, actually the kind of softer or more generalized that curve gets, which is useful for a drawing like this, where we don't need to have all of these little kinks in the outline, but actually just sort of a single smooth line segment. So try to rebuild the curves and test out a few different point counts until you get to an end curve or an end product that's relatively smooth and not too complicated. Do you guys see the difference between my starting point and where I wound up? So the initial curve is in yellow here, and you can see it's sort of very specifically oriented by the offset, whereas the new curves are much smoother. Okay, so now that we have put this together in Illustrator, I'm going to come back to my layout that I generated a couple of weeks ago. And what we're going to do is hide the aerial photograph. I just use the hide command, hide. And using the PDF function, we're going to print this line work to this specific scale to a PDF. Make sure that you have under the options for this print dialog box that it's outputting vector, not raster graphics. And for the output color, you can keep the color set to display. So it's going to keep intact all of the color variation that you generated. When I hit print, obviously it's going to give us a little window. Just make sure you save this with all the rest of your files. So what this will generate is a PDF with no real line weight attached to it. In fact, the lines are barely visible. But what's great about what this has generated is we have a to-scale print of the project where all of your files, all of your prints should be at the same scale. And just to make sure that that's correct, you can select the detail view in this layout, and you'll want to make sure that your scale reads out at 1 inch equals 200 feet. Okay. Now I'm going to come and open Illustrator. So now that we've printed our PDF, we can open it up in Illustrator, and you'll find that the line work is all there in its individual colors. It didn't preserve the layer breakdown. We can repair that later. But right now we're going to use the print PDF in order to basically align the scale of the aerial JPEG and excuse me, of the line work. So I'm going to now come to File and Place, and then navigate to the sitemap of Colfax. So these two things are not necessarily aligned the same way, nor are they at the same scale. I'm going to select all of the line work and rotate it so that Colfax runs east-west. And then I'm going to drop this aerial photograph onto its own layer and put it underneath the line work. So out of curiosity, did you all learn Illustrator using the Essentials workspace or the Essentials Classic workspace? Classic, okay. So that's what I'm going to use because it's much better than the new and improved Essentials. As a general rule, I tend to keep the stroke window kind of floating along with the colors. In this case, we're going to use the transparency menu. If you can't find that on your screen, come to Window and then check this transparency box. That's going to allow us to basically ghost out the aerial so that we can scale it to the road map without too much trouble. And theoretically, if our print went well, we should be able just to scale the image down to the edges of the line work and have everything match up between the aerial and the drawing. We did everything right. And that works pretty well. So you see I just scaled the image down to meet the edges of the line work that came out of the PDF. Is everyone with me so far on that? No? Alright, I'm going to pause it and come around. Okay, so now that we have everything in our file at the same scale, and you can see I can turn that aerial photograph on and off. The next thing that we're going to do is use the two outline curves that we generated in order to create a clipping mask. Clipping masks work off of closed shapes, not off of open line work. So the first thing that we need to do is create a two boundary lines that connect these two polylines from end to end. So I'm just making two lines and making sure they touch at the anchor points. You can join these lines together now by grabbing the anchor points and hitting Control J one at a time. If we've done everything right, we should now have a closed shape. Are you guys with me so far? And this is probably a review for most of you, but now that we have our closed shape, I can click on the shape and then click on the aerial and right-click to make a clipping mask, which will crop that image down based on the outline that we made. For this last step, now that we've created a clipping mask over our aerial photograph, I'm going to come in and double-click my way into the clipping mask until I've selected the linked file. And I'm going to set the opacity to 30%. I'd like everyone to submit their opacity to 30 for this submission so that they're all graphically similar, because we're going to kind of click through them on Monday. Okay. Then I'm going to unclick out of that clipping mask and grab all of the line work that we've made so far. This should be preserved on a layer on its own. So you could probably just select that layer. I want to preserve the appearance of the layer, the line work that's in the file right now. So I'm going to actually, copy and paste in place duplicate line work and put it on a new layer. Does that work? Yeah. So I've just duplicated layer 1 and put it on layer 2. This is going to allow me to make these shapes into fills without messing around with the imported line work that are all at different colors. You'll see why when we get into it on Monday. But for the time being, we're going to turn on the Shape Builder tool and set the attribute color to black. And I want you guys to color in black all of the footprints of buildings. Won't take too long. And if you have open space or parks, I want you to color those in white. Does that make sense to everyone? So black for buildings and white for open space. And I'm using the Shape Builder tool for this. If you haven't used the Shape Builder tool before, try to experiment with it a little bit. I've been finding that Illustrator is phasing out the paint bucket tool that I used to like so much. So I'm trying to get into this new method. This didn't take me too long to do Jennifer's. but already, just by looking at this one, we're using this figure ground reversal with using the black and the white in order to start to understand levels of density along Colfax. So get it to this level graphically. And then this is kind of the important step for me in terms of being able to capture all of your work quickly on Monday. Make sure you click on this Export for Screens button and export it as a JPEG. So that you're submitting something that kind of looks like this. Okay? So export it as a JPEG and use that Export for Screens button to do so.